The Horrific Trial and Final Days of George Boleyn, Section 1. May 15, 1536. A man stands before 2,000 witnesses, accused of the unthinkable. In his hand a folded piece of paper. The command is clear: do not read this aloud. But George Boleyn, diplomat, scholar, and brother to the Queen of England, looks out across that sea of faces and makes a choice that will echo through history. He reads it anyway. And in that single moment of defiance he signs his own death warrant while exposing the most powerful king in Europe as a fraud. This wasn't the action of a reckless fool. George Boleyn was brilliant, perhaps one of the sharpest minds of his generation. By the age of 30 he had served as England's ambassador to France 5 times. He spoke 4 languages fluently and moved through the courts of Europe with a grace that impressed even the French, who were notoriously difficult to impress. The French ambassador Jane Boleyn wrote glowing dispatches about George's intelligence and charisma, praising the force of his discourse and the keenness of his wit. This was a man who understood politics, who knew how to survive in the treacherous world of Tudor power. So why would someone that intelligent do something that appeared so catastrophically stupid? To understand that moment we need to step back into the spring of 1536, into a world of whispered conspiracies and sudden disappearances, where the wrong word could mean death and loyalty meant nothing against the machinery of royal vengeance. George Boleyn wasn't just some minor courtier caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was born around 1504 into one of England's rising families, educated possibly at Oxford, and shaped into a Renaissance man of formidable talents. He didn't just speak French, Latin, and Italian. He mastered them with a fluency that made him invaluable to the crown. He was a true believer in the religious reformation sweeping across Europe, and he risked everything for that faith. Using his diplomatic privileges, George smuggled banned Protestant texts into England. Small, cheap pamphlets designed to spread the gospel to ordinary people who had never been allowed to read scripture in their own language. Every time he crossed the channel with his diplomatic bag stuffed with forbidden books, he was gambling with his life. In an age when possessing the wrong pamphlet could get you burned alive, George Boleyn was a revolutionary. And then there wasn't. The bond between George and his sister Anne Boleyn was extraordinary, even by the standards of close siblings. Contemporary observers noted their fierce mutual affection, the way they shared everything from theological debates to hunting expeditions to quiet moments discussing poetry and scripture. They had found in each other what one historian called a common soul. George once gave in a book, possibly a Bible, with a dedication so tender it still moves readers centuries later. He apologized for not giving her gold or pearls, of which she had plenty, but instead offering something for her mind and soul. He called his own wit dull, a strange humility from a man praised across Europe for his brilliance. This closeness would later be twisted into something monstrous, weaponized by men who needed them both destroyed. By early 1536, the political landscape around Anne Boleyn had become poisonous. She had been queen for 3 years, had given Henry VIII a daughter named Elizabeth, but not the son he desperately craved. A miscarriage in January 1536 had sealed her fate in the king's mind, and his attention had already turned to Jane Seymour, a quiet lady-in-waiting who promised docility where an offered defiance. But Anne's real enemy wasn't a rival woman. It was Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and one of the most ruthless political operators in English history. Cromwell and Anne had once been allies in the fight for religious reform, but they had fallen out bitterly over the wealth pouring in from dissolved monasteries. Anne wanted that money used for education and charity. Cromwell wanted it for the crown, and for himself. The two visions were incompatible, and Cromwell knew that as long as Anne breathed, his position was precarious. According to leading historians, what happened next wasn't justice. It was a political coup, carefully orchestrated to destroy not just Anne but her entire faction. And George, brilliant and outspoken George, who spent time with the king playing tennis and cards, who could rally opposition and speak for his sister's memory, had to be eliminated too. On April 24, 1536, legal commissions were quietly established for offences supposedly committed in Middlesex and Kent. 5 days later, Queen Anne had an argument with Sir Henry Norris, one of the king's closest friends, carelessly accusing him of paying too much attention to her. On April 30th, a court musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested and taken to Thomas Cromwell's house. Smeaton was nobody, a commoner with a beautiful voice and no political power. But that's exactly why Cromwell chose him. As a commoner, Smeaton could be tortured, something legally forbidden for nobles. What happened during the 24 hours Smeaton spent in Cromwell's custody remained shrouded in darkness, but when he emerged he had confessed to adultery with the Queen. He was the only one who ever confessed, and the only one who could legally be subjected to the rack and the thumbscrew. May 1st was supposed to be a day of celebration, with jousting tournaments at Greenwich Palace. The crowds cheered as Henry VIII competed, but then something strange happened. Without warning, the king rose and left, taking Sir Henry Norris with him. Witnesses later said they were questioning Norris as they rode away. That night, Norris was in the Tower of London. The trap was closing. The next day, May 2nd, Queen Anne was arrested around noon while watching a tennis match, but before Anne even arrived at the Tower, something else happened. At around 2 in the afternoon, George Boleyn was arrested at Whitehall Palace. And here's what's haunting. The court was at Greenwich that day, not Whitehall. Everyone who mattered was at Greenwich. So why was George at a different palace entirely? Some historians believe he had already heard whispers of his sister's arrest that morning and rushed to Whitehall, trying desperately to reach the king, to protest, to do something. If that's true, then George Boleyn walked straight into a trap while trying to save his sister. By 5 that afternoon, both siblings were imprisoned in the Tower of London, held in different sections, possibly never seeing each other again. When the charges against George became public, even Anne's enemies were shocked. The accusation wasn't that he had failed to report his sister's crimes. It was something far worse, something that made the blood run cold. George Boleyn stood accused of incest with his own sister, the Queen of England. The indictment read like something from a nightmare. It claimed that on November 2, 1535, and several times before and after, Queen Anne had procured and incited her own natural brother George Boleyn to violate her. It stated that on November 5 at Westminster, George had carnally known the Queen, his own sister. And then came the charge that sealed everything, that on January 8, 1536, George and Anne together had compassed the king's death, plotted treason against the crown itself. That alone carried a mandatory death sentence. But here's what makes the whole construction collapse under scrutiny. The dates didn't work. Historians who have painstakingly traced the movements of the royal household have proven that on several of the dates mentioned, Anne and George were in completely different locations. The charges weren't just unproven, they were logistically impossible. But in the world of Tudor justice, impossibility was no defense against the will of the king. If you're listening to this story and feeling the weight of how fragile justice can be, how quickly truth can be buried under political machinery, then please consider subscribing to this channel. We dive deep into the darkest corners of history, the stories that haunt us because they reveal uncomfortable truths about power and the people crushed beneath it. Your subscription helps us keep telling these stories that deserve to be remembered. George Boleyn spent 13 days in the Tower of London knowing he would almost certainly die. He was held in the Martin Tower, and during that time he received messages from his wife Jane. And here we need to address one of history's most persistent lies. For centuries, Jane Boleyn has been portrayed as the woman who betrayed her husband, who testified against him and sent him to his death. Countless novels and television shows have painted her as a traitor, bitter and vengeful. But the evidence tells a completely different story. Just 2 days after George's arrest, Jane sent him a message of comfort. Letters between them during this period are described by historians as tender, not accusatory. Far from distancing herself from the doomed family, Jane publicly expressed sympathy for George and begged for a pardon when everyone else was fleeing as fast as they could. After the executions, Jane served as chief mourner. Does this sound like a woman who condemned her husband? Only Smeaton confessed. The others maintained their innocence. It made no difference. May 15, 1536. 2,000 people crowded into the King's Hall of the Tower of London for what everyone understood was theatre, not justice. Anne Boleyn was tried first, defending herself with quiet dignity, answering every absurd charge calmly and clearly. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Then it was George's turn. Look at who sat in judgment. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, George's own uncle, who would pronounce the death sentence. And was so distressed he had collapsed during her trial and was uneven present. For George S. this wasn't a jury of impartial observers. This was a jury of enemies, rivals, and men too terrified of Henry VIII to vote any way but guilty. What happened next surprised everyone. George didn't just defend himself, he attacked. Witnesses recorded that he answered so prudently and wisely to all articles laid against him that it was a marvel to hear, that he made himself as clear as though he had never offended. One observer compared George's defense to that of Thomas More, the martyred saint whose own trial defense had become legendary. This wasn't just prudent, it was combative. When the prosecution's only evidence for incest was that George had been found alone with his sister for extended periods, he contemptuously dismissed it. Of course he'd been alone with her, she was his sister. They talked, they discussed theology. That was evidence of a sibling relationship, not a crime. And then came the moment that defined everything. A piece of paper was handed to George. It contained information about the king's sexual problems, specifically that Anne had allegedly told Jane that Henry was neither skillful in copulating with a woman nor possessed virtue or potency. George was explicitly commanded not to read this aloud. He read it aloud to 2,000 people. Think about this choice. George Boleyn was on trial for his life. He had mounted a brilliant defense. He had made the jury uncomfortable with his logic and his eloquence. And then he deliberately publicly humiliated the King of England. Why would he do something so apparently suicidal? Because George Boleyn understood something crucial. He was going to die regardless. The trial was theatre. The verdict was predetermined. The jury was packed with enemies and cowards. There was no hope, no last-minute rescue, no miracle coming. So George decided to do something more important than beg for a mercy that would never come. He decided to tell the truth. Henry's impotence wasn't just embarrassing gossip. It went to the very heart of the charges against Anne. If the king couldn't perform sexually, then how could Anne have committed adultery? If Henry was impotent, then the entire case collapsed into the lie it had always been. By reading that note aloud, George exposed the fundamental absurdity of the prosecution. He couldn't save himself, but he could make sure that every single person in that room, all 2,000 witnesses, knew this trial was a farce. It was an act of defiance. It was an act of witness. And it sealed his fate. But George Boleyn was already a dead man walking. He chose to die telling the truth. The verdict was never in doubt. Every member of the jury found George guilty. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, his own uncle, pronounced the sentence with tears streaming down his face. George Boleyn was to be drawn through London to the gallows at Tyburn to be hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still alive, castrated and disemboweled while conscious, then beheaded and quartered. Later, King Henry mercifully commuted the sentence. George and the other condemned men would simply be beheaded. George Boleyn spent his last 2 days preparing to meet his God, the God he had risked everything to serve, the God whose scriptures he had smuggled to the people. On May 17, 1536, George Boleyn walked to the scaffold. He was 32 years old. He had been a scholar, a diplomat, a reformer, and a brother who loved his sister so much that their enemies had to twist that love into a crime to destroy them. In his final moments, he didn't recant or plead. He had already said everything that needed to be said. 2 days later, Anne Boleyn followed him into death. Their daughter Elizabeth would one day become the greatest queen England ever knew. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this story asks us something uncomfortable about ourselves and what we do when the truth costs everything.